I've titled this lecture on William James, the first of two on William James, The Radical William James. And William James surely is the quintessential Yankee philosopher. I can't imagine another culture and country producing him. James does come along in a world of mystery. He comes along when the American philosophical world is featuring the American Hegelian movement, and Hegelian thought and romanticism are fixtures not only in the thinking parts of America, but at the time in what probably was the most intensely thinking part of America, namely New England. The transcendentalist movements are there, and back to nature movements. This is a world of Thoreau and Emerson and Channing. The list is long. These are not perspectives that William James will reject by any means, but James himself is going to bring to bear on them a characteristically, shall I say, Jamesian view. Now, when I say a world of mystery, is this just an academic thinking that the world at large concerns itself with whatever academics are concerned with? Well, let me read a passage from a 1907 magazine article that Oxford's own Professor Henry Jones composed, writing here on how Hegelian thought has overtaken English thought and the English universities. His fear is that the epidemic is spreading almost without surcease, almost without challenge. Here's the passage. There are ellipses throughout, but here's the main, ellipses throughout, but here's the main point. He says, quoting now Hobhouse, quote, "The Rhine has flowed into the Thames. Carlyle introduced it, bringing it as far up as Chelsea. Then Jowett and Thomas Hill Green and William Wallace and Louis Nettleship guided the waters into the Isis. They have passed up the Marcy. They pollute the Bay of St. Andrews and swell the waters of the Cam. The stream of German idealism has been diffused over the academical world of Great Britain. The disaster is universal." So Hegel's influence on American philosophy was as broad and deep in the second half of the 19th century, centered first in non-academic intellectual circles, chiefly St. Louis. Hegelianism would be embraced by leading academic figures such as John Dewey and Josiah Royce. The latter would become a very good friend and philosophical adversary of William James during the time both were on the Harvard faculty. Royce there as a result of James's admiration and support. So here then is an American philosophy at home with idealism, discoursing energetically on the absolute, splitting hairs over whether absolutism is compatible with free will, etc. This is a world of deep and only suggestive mystery that William James is entering, and it's a world that he's going to try to set aright through a clear, pragmatic, practical, basic, may I say it, Yankee thought, a confidence in the evidence of sense, a firm belief that for all its faults, common sense is about the best thing we've got going for us. And in thorough Reidian fashion, I would say, the belief that when philosophy and science conflict directly with the central precepts of common sense, it better be science and philosophy that give way. James's project is to rescue thought from the seductions of the worlds of mystery, while preserving its fluidity, its purpose, its variegated nature. Now, James didn't arrive at his project all of a sudden. He got there in a rather plodding way. Life began for him as a child of privilege, born in Manhattan in 1842, the eldest of 4 children, grandson of a multimillionaire. His father, Henry, was a man of academic tastes and religious conviction, a disciple of Swedenborg, and an internationalist in perspective. Swedenborg, recall, was the 18th century genius, philosopher, scientist, mystic, whose theological works were consonant with Christianity, but in a different voice, as it were. His New Jerusalem won adherents. There's still an active Swedenborgian society, and Henry James Sr. was a member of that. The James children were well-traveled, often at the expense of a stable school life. By age 18, William had settled on a career as a painter, but he abandoned it in less than a year for, of all things, the chemistry program at Harvard. It took James longer than usual to complete his studies at Harvard. They were interrupted by bouts of illness. It's clear that he learned more at home during periods of recovery than in the Harvard classrooms. He read voraciously, and he retained what he learned. Still casting about for a career, which is what one settles for when there is no calling, he spent 6 years completing required studies for a medical degree, this between 1863 and 1869. He dropped out once for what proved to be an unsatisfying exploration of the Amazon that was being conducted by Louis Agassiz, and a second time for travels in Germany, where thanks to lectures by Helmholtz and by Wundt, his interests in sensory processes and in psychology were aroused. He wrote to his father from Germany, indicating his intention now to take in these lectures, and he was clearly impressed by the findings reached through experimentation and by the ability to decipher scientifically at least one feature of the mind at work. He returned to Harvard forthwith, completed his medical training, and joined the faculty in 1872. And within a few years, we find him giving lectures in physiological psychology and indeed actually presiding over some experiments in a laboratory he set up himself. Still, James suffered from various maladies and was beset by interludes of fear and depression. His psychological turmoil was treated best by wide and deep reading. Here was a doctor doctoring himself, chiefly by way of the consolations of philosophy. No career in sight, William James now had a vocation. As for his famous brother, travel brought him to an England that seemed much like a homeland from the first. And so in time, Henry James would obtain British citizenship, would have a flat in Chelsea, and a house outside of London, as brother William felt no such pull at all. There were questions about whether Wundt or James deserves the title of first academic experimental psychologist. James actually was a bit prickly on this subject, insisting that he didn't really get the credit he deserved for that. Of course, the work that every psychologist knows by William James is Principles of Psychology, which he promised his publisher in 2 years and which actually took him a dozen years to complete. May I say it remains the classic treatise in academic psychology. It's a good read to this day. Where it's overtaken by history is not all that important. You can fill in those gaps. But the perspective is wonderful and rich. It's a thoroughly documented work, rich in footnotes. He knows everything going on in the world of psychological thought. He takes out of that world of thought what is most worthy of attention. He treats it fairly and in an utterly winning way. I might say he may be the best author in that family, and I'm an admirer of Henry James, and he certainly has put together the most interesting of that otherwise arid species, the textbook. Well, after the completion of Principles of Psychology, almost all of James's writing is addressed chiefly to the grounding of our knowledge, the basis upon which we accept things as true, what the right attitude should be toward our experiences of the world, what the right attitude should be toward issues of verification, the vindication of theories, their falsification. He will also address himself to the ethical and indeed spiritual dimensions of life for reasons that grow out of what he calls his radical empiricism. And I'm going to pause here to make clear just what it means to be a radical empiricist and to be the radical William James. For it is this that gives power and consistency to the entire range of James's thought. Now, the usual adoption of or concession to empiricistic philosophies is a hedged one. The apologist is likely to say something along these lines. Well, of course, a lot of the things we know as a result of experience. There are some things we can't know by way of experience, these being sort of abstract, Leibnizian, Cartesian sorts of things. And anyway, the senses really can deceive us from time to time, but by and large, I'm certainly willing to use my senses in most of the ordinary business of life. Now, this, I say, is a position that is as boring as it is probably faultless. It most assuredly is not the position of a radical empiricist. John Locke, for example, is not a radical empiricist. When Locke says that the mind is furnished by experience, but then includes certain original acts of the mind, he sounds a bit like Descartes, but not at all like a radical empiricist would sound. Now, how about religious experiences and religious visions? How about premonitions that are reliably experienced by people? How about out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences? What would William James say about all this? James is consistent. What radical empiricism requires is this: no set of experiences has an authority superior to some other set of experiences. It's not the business or province of science or philosophy to declare which experiences are legitimate. The business of science and philosophy is to come to terms with experience as it is had, as it is reported. No experience is off limits. Find a set of experiences that don't match up very well with the received wisdom of science and philosophy, and that signals a problem for science and philosophy. Experience is under no obligation to justify itself before some court that would declare itself to be of greater authority. Do we get the point? Now, that's the consistent position. What figures in the human imagination in a reliable way is to be dealt with, not dismissed as too complex, too strange, etc. And it is to be dealt with on its own terms. Hence James's famous critique of associationist thought and philosophy, a form of thought we find in Aristotle, Locke, Hume, scores of others. The associationist theory of mind is based on the notion that mental entities are corpuscular and elemental, that these are somehow pulled or held together as a result of repetition or some such, that thus assembled they now stand as real ideas, etc. Well, one can nearly feel James's impatience and amusement. In so many words he asks, how did philosophy ever come to a view like that? It surely could not be on the basis of experience. No one has ever had an experience of that kind. For example, suppose we line up a half-dozen people and we give each of them a word on a card. Nobody can see anyone else's cards, only his own card. You can't get a sentence out of something like that. No one has a sentence, not one of them has a sentence, and this is what the theory of association calls for. First we record sensation element or corpuscle A, then B, then C. These are utterly independent according to the associationist theory, but through some sort of mechanism or process they become connected. But who possesses the outcome of all this? Is there any authorizing intelligence that is integrating all this? So William James notes that, quote, this argument has never been answered. It holds good against any talk about self-compounding amongst feelings, against any blending or complication or mental chemistry in the absence of a supernumerary principle of consciousness. The mind-stuff theory, in short, is unintelligible, close quote. The mind-stuff theory is unintelligible because what it does not include is what James calls a supernumerary principle of consciousness. You've got to have an intact, alert, sensitive, willful being who draws upon the resources of the world and frames ideas not as corpuscles. No one ever had an experience like that. There's no empty can that becomes filled up with corpuscles held together mindlessly. Rather, there must be a supernumerary, authenticating, integrating intelligence. Mind, however, is not going to be treated as some sort of Cartesian substance or entity. On James's account, consciousness is not an entity, but a process. Now, this is not to depreciate consciousness. Rather, it is a process not only as real as anything else, but the one on which something enters reality as known. Anything would enter reality as known. So James, again, on associationism, will be a gloss on this point. Quote, the class of phenomena which the associationist school takes to frame its theory of the ego are feelings unaware of each other. The class of phenomena the ego presents are feelings of which the later ones are intensely aware of those that went before. No shuffling of unaware feelings can make them aware, close quote. Now, James's point here is that in the stream of consciousness, the ideas that we have invariably look back on those that preceded them and ahead to those that are to come. There is a continuity of thought, a continuity of mental life that is not only not captured by the mind stuff theory, but associationism and the mind stuff theory simply can't deal with the continuity of thought, which happens to be its central characteristic, as revealed immediately by what? By our experience. For example, every thought is someone's thought. Every thought is owned. Associationism makes no provision for the owner. David Hume's parade formation will not work absent someone viewing the parade. There isn't anyone whose parade this is. Now, James here is not trying to restore a substance theory of self or soul. Rather, he's reflecting on the nature of his own experience. Experience is the rule here, and he concludes that his thoughts are his own, and that any plausible theory of ideation must take account of that fact. There can be no philosophy of thought, only a philosophy of the thoughts that persons actually have. James is certain that the traditional Anglo-European mental chemistry just misses the main point. Now, the other characteristic of thought is that it inevitably includes the element of selection. Look, the world is a world of incessant stimulation. We don't see and hear it all. We couldn't. We pick out things that we're going to look at. We pick out things based on what we judge to be in our interest to pick out. Again, you have to have a psychologically active, dynamic mental life in the first instance for these experiences to take the shape and form that they actually do. And any developed philosophy of mind is going to have to come to grips with this. It's going to have to come to grips with those conscious processes on which we erect notions of will, attention, selectivity. In chapter 11 of his Psychology, James develops the point this way, quote, 4 characters in consciousness. How does it go on? We notice immediately 4 important characters in the process. 1. Every state tends to be part of a personal consciousness. 2. Within each personal consciousness, states are always changing. 3. Each personal consciousness is sensibly continuous. 4. It is interested in some parts of its object to the exclusion of others, and welcomes or rejects, chooses from among them, in a word, all the while. Close quote. Now, where does this consciousness come from? Suppose you consult evolutionary theory, which itself is a kind of progressive, associational sort of theory. Now, James is this way and that way about evolutionary theory, for he tends to be uncomfortable with theory as an alternative to experience. But on the matter of mental life, he's satisfied that it too has followed an evolutionary course in the animal kingdom, and thus animal consciousness is a warranted assumption. But we now have to consider whether this settles or even recognizes the problem of the origin of consciousness. Look, let us grant that we are conscious. Now, on the evolutionary account, what would we then say about, for example, other primates? Would we say they are less conscious? And then dogs and cats, rabbits and sparrows, fish and frogs. Darwin's is a continuity theory, according to which what we find at the level of human psychology is approximated to some degree further and further down in the phylogenetic series. Now, if we do find some creature that has a bit less consciousness, and then another with even less, have we explained or settled the problem of consciousness? James had a bit of fun with this one. He offers us an amusing example in a play that was making the rounds in James's day, Midshipman Easy, by Captain Frederick Marryat. Now, in the play, a young servant becomes pregnant out of wedlock, and when finally confronted, her defense is that, quote, "Well, sir, it's a very small baby," close quote. Now, James knows that we do not explain consciousness by pointing to earlier manifestations of it, which somehow are very small consciousnesses. The small consciousness is as difficult to explain as the larger one. When we turn this back again to evolutionary theory, we see that the notion of survival now takes on a radically different character. That is, there are 2 ways you can consider survival of the fittest, or evolutionary pressures conducing to adaptive behavior. One way is that there's some sort of process or force going on somewhere in nature, do you see, natural selection, whatever it is. And it's sort of playing on the attributes of animals, such that some of those attributes are picked out for propagation and others of those attributes become the basis upon which the species is eliminated. Now that's one view. But James asks us to consider what happens when you consult again the authoritative realm, which is the realm of experience. And he says, quote, "We treat survival as if it were an absolute end, existing as such in the physical world, a sort of actual should be. We forget that in the absence of some such superadded commenting intelligence, the reactions cannot be properly talked of as useful or hurtful at all. The moment you bring consciousness into the midst, survival ceases to be a mere hypothesis. No longer is it, quote, if survival is to occur, close quote. It has now become an imperative decree. Survival shall occur. Real ends now appear for the first time upon the world stage." So you see intentionality, interest, selectivity, consciousness, self-consciousness. This is what experience turns up as real. And a philosophy of mind unable to come to terms with that must be defective and incomplete. Now, I think here it's worth noting that James's criticism is not unlike the criticism of the Romantic idealists, going back to Goethe's criticism of Newton's theory of light. Newton's optical theory tells us everything about light except what we see. And James's argument is that the scientific reductionist approach is a one-sided affair that can only explain the natural world by traducing it into something entirely unnatural. James is part of that tradition. He's not immune to it. He derives benefit from the Romantic idealist critique of reductionistic science. But at the same time, he cannot accept the Hegelian philosophy. He resists an agenda that is anti-scientific, even while reserving the right to reveal the defects of a defective science. The Hegelian claims to an understanding of the universe is, quote, through and through complexity, its accessibility to logical demonstrations. All this strikes James as learned hubris. In chapter 12 of his Essays in Radical Empiricism, he offers this memorable critique of the entire Hegelian enterprise. Quote, "The through and through philosophy seems too buttoned up and white-chokered and clean-shaven a thing to speak for the vast, slow-breathing, unconscious cosmos with its dread abysses and its unknown tides." Close quote. James quipped that every time the Hegelians refer to the absolute ego, they sound as if they're going up in a balloon. What he urges instead is a philosophy and a science that will come to terms with the world as known and knowable. That centrally includes every aspect of experience that is reliable, recorded in the daily life of sensate, attending, selecting, conscious human beings. So the summons is to realism, even a common sense realism. When James canvasses the ways in which mental life is examined, he notices a pervasive fallacy and a dangerous one. Here he was not only ahead of his time, but I think ahead of our time too. He notes the troubling connection between what is said about a phenomenon and the method chosen to examine it. There is an unblushing tendency to assume that the real nature of the phenomenon just is whatever the chosen method has turned up. He refers to this as the psychologist's fallacy, and he treats it this way in chapter 7 of his Principles of Psychology. Quote, "The great snare of the psychologist is the confusion of his own standpoint with that of the mental fact about which he is making his report. The psychologist stands outside of the mental state he speaks of. Both itself and its object are objects for him." Close quote. The psychologist's fallacy generally is assuming that a mental phenomenon is of a certain kind because your method of inquiry was able to examine only that feature of it or examine it only in that way. The fallacy of assuming that what goes on in reality is just what mimics what was going on in your experiment, given the method you were choosing. It is the fallacy of assuming that the experience as experienced or the thought as thought has the properties or essential nature of whatever it is the researcher notes based on a chosen method inevitably limited. Now, in these several respects, James was picking up a tradition that had largely been lost during the heyday of John Stuart Mill's philosophy. Mill's very influential An Examination of Sir William Hamilton's Philosophy claimed Thomas Reid as one of its principal casualties. In that work, Mill identified Reid with Kant and others in what he called the intuitionist school, treating common sense principles as a kind of intuition. Now, surely one of the reasons Reid fell out of favor was because of the perceived success of John Stuart Mill's critique of the intuitionist school, and I should say the wrongful assignment of Reid to that school. But James is picking up the Reidian baton and defending the following precepts, which are largely Reidian. First, the proper method of investigation is a scientific method that takes the facts where it finds them. That is, you don't develop a theory that excludes facts as a condition of the theory working. You develop a theory capable of meeting the facts on the fact's own terms. Secondly, what constitutes a fact is any reliable representation in experience. That is, facts do not become facts through the authority of scientific or philosophical systems, but through the actual engagement of human beings with the world in which they live. Now, what about common sense principles? Well, James speaks directly of common sense principles and does so in a context that is quite congenial to, let's say, evolutionary theory in the broader, I'm inclined to say, softer sense. Creatures, human and otherwise, face challenges daily. Common sense is the means by which we come to terms with these challenges. To be skeptical about common sense is to be skeptical about that one resource that is most serviceable as we go about trying to meet the challenges and overcome the obstacles of daily life. Now, it turns out, however, that the challenges to one are not the same as the challenges to all. The kind of creature you are determines what is of greatest interest to you. James illustrates this in a particularly winning way. He says that when he sits in his chair reading a book, his eyes are moving across its pages. He's engrossed. But sitting in front of him is his dog, looking up, watching the eyes moving across these pages, and lamenting the fact that James doesn't seem to know that in a matter of moments, a stick could be in the air. Now, what are we to say about the dog who just can't wait for the stick to be in the air, and William James who just can't wait to get to the next chapter? Do we want to say that one set of those experiences is inauthentic and the other one authentic? Or do we want to say that there are different interests that will express themselves in different attentive selections, in different conscious processes devoted to something uniquely important to a given species, a given person, uniquely important to one person under particular circumstances in life? And to try to wash this out with allegedly general laws that become lawful only by ignoring the facts of daily life is not to prosecute the agenda of philosophy or science, but to engage in a species of self-deception. We're to be empiricists, says James, in the radical sense. We are to accept the contents of our conscious life, not consciousness as something we see when we look inside the head. James is satisfied that at the end of the day, we come to grips with the fact that we are fire and clay, that there is a brain and an embodiment, that our biology is always and ever with us. There seems to be a set of conscious mental processes that, fire-like, are not easily encapsulated into the husk of the body or found in the biological details. That this two-ness in one is an inevitability to be dealt with by philosophy and science is unavoidable, but that neither philosophy nor science can advance by denying the reality of either as an attempt, in some attempt to celebrate the other or establish its hegemony, is what has to be avoided. So James is a practical, common sense, experience-based American philosopher wanting to get on with the show, taking the facts where the facts are, taking them where he finds them, leading him to a pattern of thought that will go in any direction that experience reliably points to. He's not going up in a balloon, and he's summoning some of his American colleagues back to Earth as well, their having gone up in a balloon and having very little to show for it except a kind of dizziness. Bill James, American radical empiricist. Read him, you'll love it.